Welcome back. I am John P. Today I'm going to be answering your questions that you have asked me on my Instagram, The Real John P. From time to time, I post a question function where you can ask me certain things about the watch industry, myself, what goes on behind the scenes as someone in the watch industry, as a watch dealer, and so many other things. And it's really great to be able to kind of see what you're thinking and also be able to field questions or topics that fellow collectors feel are important to address out here on the internet. So make sure to follow me over there on my Instagram, The Real John P, where you can ask these questions in the future. We're gonna be talking about Rolex, the market crash. I know, bit of a beating of a dead horse here, but it's something someone asked. Different watches, why they're popular, why some features are not popular, and so many more things, so stick with me here. Now, the first question is, of course, is the Rolex crash over? Would now be a safe time to buy a Rolex? Well, what I'll say is that the market has quite leveled out for some of these more in-demand watches, the blue chip kind of staple investment pieces, as some sources were touting them over the last few years. So in short, there's a more like elongated answer. Maybe I'll make a full video on this in the future. If you want me to, leave that in the comments below. But in short, there has been a bit of a leveling off of these more in-demand watches, and now is not a bad time if you've been on the fence, but I would not be looking at them as investment pieces per se. I would be more so looking at them as buying them cheaper than you would have had to a year ago if you want to wear and enjoy and love the watch. That's really my recommendations on the Rolex watches today and probably at least in the foreseeable future. Now, the next question is, why do you sometimes sell watches that are negatively reviewed by you? Now, I don't really negatively review anything too much, but there might be a watch that maybe I have a preference of over another, or maybe there's a function or a feature, or typically I will admittedly scrutinize a watch for maybe the price compared to another watch from another brand. I know with Omega watches, I've put them under scrutiny a little bit over the past couple of months, I think, but that's just something that comes with reviewing watches independently in a way, right? So the great thing about us here and at Del Rey Watch is that we are not held to the brands. We don't rely on Omega sending us a watch, or Rolex sending us a watch, or Richemont, or JLC, or any of that sort. These brands are not sending us these watches. And so sometimes, I can truly share with you my thoughts, opinions, without really feeling any kind of negative feedback from these brands, because I'm not held to them. We're not an authorized dealer. We sell pre-owned. And that's where I like it, because I don't feel like I'm held to some type of company that's going to dictate what I do, say, think, and believe, and I can share with you my opinions. And if I don't like a particular watch model, it doesn't mean that other collectors out there shouldn't as well. Maybe you like it for other reasons, or the reasons that I bring up are just not something that you agree with, and in which case, that's awesome, and we're glad to stock these watches in the door. Most of these watches, it's never anything really major. So if someone just likes the design and maybe I don't like the design, absolutely, everyone to each their own, right? I can't love every watch in the world, and I certainly can't come up with criticisms of every watch in the world either. So that's what's so cool about watch collecting today, is everyone has their preferences, and what we stock in the door, if someone loves it, great. We'd love to be able to help or take it in on trade as well. So that's something to consider. But specifically, let's talk about the Tudor GMT. When that watch came out, yeah, there were some initial concerns with the movements, in which case, stood aside. We're not eager to put those in inventory, but those are so rare, few and far between when you actually see mechanical issues. Now, the next question is, how is the watch strap business doing? A while back, at least a year or so at this point, it kind of went in stages, but I started a watch strap company called Sinclair Straps, sinclairstraps.com, where we sell premium watch straps. And I have to admit, we do sell some straps on this site, and we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these straps in inventory. But I will say that I've been spending the bulk of my time on the watch side of the business. Interestingly enough, there's actually much more hand-holding and question answering that's required from the strap business. So I don't focus on it a ton. If you do need a strap, you're more than welcome to check it out there and get yourself a nice strap for a watch that you have. But in terms of like primary focus, I really have been focusing on the watch business and some other endeavors because it's just truly been the best use of my time. But if someone does buy a strap, we're always glad to fulfill that order. Maybe in the future, I will bring on a team for that company and grow it a little bit more. The strap market's kind of become competitive. Not sure where I'll take that, but it is at least somewhat operational. If you need a strap, feel free to check that out. The next question is, what is your favorite quartz digital watch? I actually really enjoy the original series of the Breitling Aerospace. I think it's cool. I love that bullet bracelet. I think at the time, Breitling really was pushing the envelope for what that was. And it came out in a time that was kind of interesting. It's transitional period today. The quartz crisis was pretty much over, but they still were doing it, and it had so many different functions, and they've really expanded on that, offering different super quartz watches into today, even up until a somewhat recent release of the last few years, the Breitling Endurance, which collectors love. We sell a ton of them at Delray Watch. And so I love that, and I think it's interesting that Breitling has stayed with quartz for so long. Very cool watch, the original Breitling Aerospace. Now the next question is the Rolex Midas. Love it or hate it? I'm on the fence. I would say historically, this watch, this integrated design. Now this isn't your AP integrated design. This is more of a bracelet watch, as they call them, a jewelry watch. This was a very popular segment for traditional ladies' watches, more smaller watches where the case was flush with the bracelet entirely to where the whole watch just looked like a bracelet. Patek did this, Vacheron did this. A lot of brands had this. That was kind of this 70s/early 80s older man retirement kind of style watch if we're talking about the men's variations. So particularly the Midas, kind of that the Rolex with the gold Midas touch, the King Midas touch. That's what it's essentially named after, the touch of gold, the old story there. I'm really on the fence. I don't think it's in line with the rest of things Rolex offers. And I'm not sure. I will say that it's tough right now because there are there's a lot of journals and magazines and outlets that have started talking about this because there's a handful of celebrities kind of wearing these. Think similar things have happened with Cartier, the Cartier crash. You had different celebrities and musicians put them on their wrist, and then the brand kind of got some notoriety from that. You saw it with different watches in the past as well. And so I see these watches gain speed, but interesting watch design, but I'll leave it at that. I do have a different perspective because I generally don't follow the hypes and the trends on watches. I know a bit of a long-winded answer, but I really do want to see how this one plays out in the watch market today. Now, the next question is, what is a watch that no one talks about, but I personally would buy? Now, interestingly enough, we brought in some of these watches at Delray Watch called, from a manufacturer or a brand rather, called Anordain, and they are based actually in Scotland, Glasgow, and they are known for having more approachable enamel dials and very interesting, cool dials. And I think that because the watch market has become so competitive, especially among micro brands, doing unique and interesting things that are just a little bit different is going to be where the brands really win with collectors, and not necessarily pushing the limits of the technology or doing the things that the big guys can do with pretty much the snap of a finger, because they have the teams, the R&D, the intellectual property and all that. So when something, someone just does something very unique and special and owns a niche, I like to see that. And I think this brand is something cool to look at if you are looking for something unique and interesting. Now, the next question is, what do you think about the Omega Seamaster 300m? Is this a good value? So I believe the current retail price is about $5,600 is the suggested retail manufacturer price on a bracelet, and you can have them for a much less, depending on the specific color, the model, so on. I view this as pretty much a half-price Rolex Seamaster. I really do believe it. It doesn't look exactly like a Rolex Seamaster, but spec for spec, it really is on par. Just looking at the specs and the feel-wise, I believe that it's there for me as well. And I'm not shy to put, to wear some of these. I've had some of these in my collection. I think they're really great watches. But that being said, if you want a sub, you're really only going to be happy with the sub, but many people want this watch. They like the look, they like the colors, and in which case I'd say go for it. And the people that are looking for a better bang for buck alternative to the sub, this is a great watch. I would say get one now before the prices climb, because they do go pretty quickly when we get them in stock. So I know they're growing in popularity and collectors do love them. Now the next question is, what are the least reliable brands that you see come in? This is tricky, right? Because we're mostly working with enthusiasts and collectors, so we don't have, the most diverse sample size. I mean, generally, look, you're watching these videos, you must, to some degree, want to learn about watches, you enjoy them, it's a passion, it's a hobby, and maybe not just a casual purchase. And I think that if we included those people, then we'd get a better feel for what, the most unreliable watches are. That being said, I have to say, I do hear a lot of things about the unreliability of certain Audemars Piguet Royal Oak references, especially some of the older Royal Oak offshore. We do get requests to service these things. It usually has to do with the mechanics, not necessarily the case construction, which they're known for, great case construction, the Royal Oak offshore, big chunky watches. But I will say, interestingly enough, not saying that they are the most unreliable, but it could just be a function of there being so many of these watches just out there in the world, is we receive so many service requests for Seiko watches. A lot of them have to do with a misaligned chapter ring matching the bezel and things like that, which is something that typically we wouldn't handle, nor would we handle the servicing of a Seiko watch. But there are people that do specialize in that, and Seiko also does that as well. But to answer your question, we see a lot of requests for different servicing or modifications to Seiko watches. The next question is, will mechanical watches experience a decline like they did during the quartz crisis? I see there being a decline in the casual buyers, right? The people that would buy them for investment, for hoarding, for flipping. There's certainly a decline in that. You see it in the prices, and you see it in the influx in inventory that's out there on the market. But there are so many new people that are getting into watch collecting every day. It's a hobby that is expanding, and it's a hobby more so than just a luxury item for many people today. So I don't think it's necessarily the same thing as the quartz crisis. I think that mechanical watches are probably here more so as a hobby, and not so much as something nice to buy. Next question is, when is a watch too thick? This person is thinking of buying the B25 Datora by Breitling. This is a pretty thick watch. We've had some of them at Delray Watch, and it's just north of 15 millimeters thick. Now, many Rolex Seamaster models, for example, are hovering around that 10 millimeters thick. There's variations depending on the year, the reference, and all that, but we're in that kind of ballpark range. And when we look at this 15.35 millimeter case size, that's a thick watch. And I remember putting this watch on my wrist. It's too thick for me personally, and having about a 6.5 inch circumference wrist. So I personally would probably not wear it. Now, this watch is based on the Concepto movement that is based on the Valjoux 7750. And this is kind of this almost a modular or plug-and-play concept movement where this particular company, Concepto, will work with a manufacturer to come up with a movement that works for them, however they're trying to accomplish this. And they tend to really build this on this, 7750-esque platform, which is a chronograph movement, which is a thicker movement, but they're kind of replacing certain mechanics that the movement would have, and placing different modules on them to make things like this a more complicated watch. So that's going to add some thickness to the watch, and I think gone are the days where watch manufacturers are making a caliber that just has one complication, and here are the days where there are just kind of mixing and matching different pieces, which is going to add thickness or width, and people seem to not really mind because they get a cool watch and it does end up working for the watch manufacturers. The next question, and this is kind of interesting because this is something that I've talked about. This is, will vintage Ebel become collectible? They seem to have great history, designs, and movements. So interestingly enough, I actually like some of the older Ebel chronographs that are driven by Zenith El Primeros. I think that the Sport Wave is just a cool style, and I would like to see Ebel kind of revitalize the brand and maybe come back to where they were in the late 90s. I think there's a cool style, but that being said, it's pretty niche. The micro brands today are very competitive. I don't know that I'd make Ebel necessarily a micro brand, but that's who's in their market, and they have a high marketing budget. And so unless they can adapt to the times, I don't know that they'll pull that off. But I think the older Ebels could be ripe for being collectible, maybe in the future with that El Primero movement, if Ebel is able to turn around, but I don't see them doing it now. That being said, I don't really have anything negative to say against the older Ebels. I actually really enjoy them. And the last question for today that I'll answer is, this person says, the Rolex Glide Lock is useful. Why restrict it when no one dives in a Rolex? Well, interestingly enough, people do still dive in a Rolex. Maybe they bring it in addition as a backup to their diving computer, something like that. I have had people say this, and there are people that will wear Rolex watches to go snorkeling or diving without needing, a proper depth gauge. Maybe they're not going diving with, a breathing apparatus. They're, just going free diving, something like that. I get it. But the thing is, with watches, there's so many complications, features, and functions, and people generally don't need any of them. People don't need a tourbillon. People don't really need a chronograph, right? Why would you need a chronograph? You could use your phone. You don't need any of these complications, moon phase, anything like that. A computer, your phone, anything electronic is just going to be more accurate. It's going to be quicker, more convenient. It's not going to break in the same way. It doesn't need to be oiled. You don't have to take your phone, drop it off at the watchmaker, get it oiled up. Oh, put this on the time grapher. None of that stuff exists. So these are really just fun, interesting things that people can say, isn't that cool? And I think it's cool. I think it's cool. And so they make these things, there's a bit of nostalgia, history involved. Oh, people used to use these things for XYZ in the past. People, took this watch into outer space and landed on the moon, and people like that. It's part of the romance behind some of it. And that's what drives some people to kind of associate themselves with the brands, like Breitling with airplanes once upon a time. People that like planes were kind of trying or scratching to buy a Breitling Navitimer. So that's kind of where a lot of that falls into today. People don't really need these things, but it's nice. It's cool to say you have it for some people. And that's likely kind of the idea behind some of these functions. Not saying specifically with this clasp or the glide lock with Rolex, but just all these things in general. So why do they do it? Just because they can. So guys, what do you think? Do you have any responses to these questions? I'd love to see it in here in the comments below. Also, please do not forget to check me out on Instagram, The Real John P, where you can ask more questions in the future, which I will incorporate into other videos and short form content. And we'll see you next time. You've been chatting with John P.